Okay, I got a short video, hopefully short, on labor, immigration, and your readings from Octavio Paz and Tomas Rivera, as well as short reference to the film clip you watched from the 2010 documentary, Which Way Home. So in terms of labor and immigration in the United States, when referencing Mexican Americans, Latinos, and Latin Americans, largely we're going to talk historically about manual labor that is unskilled and migrant, meaning moving to areas of the country where labor is needed at the time, whether that be with the hands in the fields, or railroad work, or meat packing, cowboys and farm hands, those sort of things. Historically, the presence of the presence of Mexicans in the United States has been largely as a part of this labor class. In the early part of the 20th century, immigration patterns from Central America and Mexico were based largely on this economic need. And I made mention of the push-pull factor in talking about immigration. And when we say this, we're largely talking about something in one's home country pushing immigration to another country, and something in that second country which draws the immigrants in. And most times out of 10, 9 times out of 10, it's usually economic issues. And at the first part of the 20th century in Mexico, the Mexican Revolution begins in earnest in 1910 and creates a huge situation where economy and livelihood are threatened in Mexico, and the U.S. economy is in need of unskilled labor, so the push-pull effect is in large effect at this time. In fact, up until the late 1920s and 30s, Mexican-American presence in the United States was pretty strong and fairly well organized. Reganches, or people who would hook up immigrants crossing the border and help them find jobs, were making good connections throughout much of the Southwest, but all over the United States, really, in this time. In fact, people would cross the border quite uneventfully and be met by reganches who would tell them that they needed people over here for railroad work, or they needed good harvesters in the field over here, multiple hands, and hook them up with work. This goes on for a long time into the 30s, or into the beginning of the 30s, until the American Great Depression hits, which, as we know from any sort of history, this causes the economic bottom to fall out, and jobs were scarce, money and food and other goods were scarce during this time. And as documented in works like The Grapes of Wrath, many Americans moved out of the Dust Bowl areas of the Midwest into other parts of the country seeking work, because not only was the economy in the tank, but the natural resources at the time were also far below being taken care of. So this coupled together to create a loss of job, loss of opportunity. So during this time, those Mexican Americans, or Mexicans who were here, filling many of those manual labor jobs that were needed in a booming economy, were over time pushed out through a series of legalized deportations. They called them repatriation, which sounds like euphemistically sending one back to one's country. You're being re-countried. But often these resulted more in forced deportations, where they were moved out of the country with force and with pretty good intention. This happened to Mexicans living in the United States who were legally American citizens, as well as Mexicans who were here as immigrants. So there was no distinction made between the two. And in fact, there was a huge sort of racialized discrimination during this time as well. So this happened all throughout the 30s and into the 40s. During the 1940s, the United States becomes involved in World War II and generates more economic growth because of this and because of a series of programs that helped ease us out of the Great Depression. But the economy begins to raise during this time. Those jobs that were filled before by Mexicans and workers in the fields and other labor industries were needed to be filled again. And so born of this situation was a famous program between the United States and Mexican workers that is referred to as the Braceros program. And the reason it's called this is because it refers to the Mexican being a manual labor provider, working with one's arms, or brazas, as it is in Spanish. So Braceros program is in reference to this. If you go to the slideshow, there's a slideshow called Migrant Farm Workers on your website. There's some pictures here where you can, I'll let you scroll through this on your own. Pictures documenting the lifestyle and the children in the fields and the housing situations, as well as a last slide showing the most famous of all Mexican labor leaders, Cesar Chavez, who we'll get to in a little bit. But if you look at that PowerPoint presentation, you'll get an idea of what these Braceros workers would have experienced during the time. Now, they have contracts with the government that would run out during a specified amount of time, and they would be, again, thought to be repatriated to their home countries after those contracts were awarded. So at the time, this would have seemed like a solid relationship for both countries and both parties involved. The second thing that happens, the first being the Great Depression, but the second thing that happens at this time in concerns to labor is the rise in the presence of unions and American Communist Party tracking specifically the concerns of the American worker, which Mexicans, Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, and others were all part of the unskilled labor working force who would have been targeted and drawn into communist agenda in terms of creating union representation. One of the things that's often been seen about communism during this time is that communism often eschewed race or an ignored race for class loyalty along the working class and the lower middle class, seeing commonalities that drew them together for the greater good and ignoring the separate issues of race. So during this time, of course, there's a growing fear in terms of what communism meant to the American people, and on the heels of this would come the McCarthy hearings before Congress, which would brand communists as the threats to American national security, and communism in general was seen as dangerous to the American way of life. And so its connotations of labor unions, which were really seeking to represent the causes and concerns of the worker, were branded as being un-American. And Chavez, who we just mentioned a minute ago, would have had a large relationship at this time in terms of creating labor unions looking to push for better wages, better working conditions, and better treatment by the large farm owners who were employing many, many migrant laborers in their fields. A couple of other things that you'll see on your lecture notes there that I'll mention briefly. After World War II and into the 50s especially, during the Braceros program rise and more immigrants coming into the country, that we see another period of nativism in American history. And nativism meaning a preference for those who are native-born American, and outsiders and immigrants in general are seen to be sources of fear and threat and disregard for an existent way of doing things. If you look down a little further, a couple of other labor issues. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is established in 1994, supposedly built to draw Canada, the United States, and Mexico together in a seemingly more universal trade pact that would allow for goods and labor and people and workers to be exchanged more freely, theoretically, over this time. But what it really does is allows the strong economies, particularly like the U.S., to really use those guidelines and rules to help bolster their already booming economies. And one of the examples here is this allows the United States to establish factories of all kinds in lower income economies like Mexico right across the border in order to take advantage of the labor force and the economy in that region. And these are known as maquiladoras. And you'll have heard of these very famously as being exploitative of young women workers particularly. And these factories run almost 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and have created a very dependent workforce out of these young women, as well as you may have heard of them in the news because they're running so frequently, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They create situations where these women are leaving the factory at many hours of the day, odd hours into the morning, etc., and creating dangerous situations, and have resulted in, since the late early 1990s, multiple hundreds of missing women who theorists have pondered just what the syndicate is behind all these missing women, if they're all connected, if it's just a coincidence, etc. There are far too many for this to be any sort of strong coincidence. Some things to note for later here. You'll see these on your notes as well. The Chicano movement, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the course, but part of that movement, the civil rights movement of the 60s, was focused on labor conditions. And as I already mentioned, Cesar Chavez and others, Dolores Huerta, really began to organize migrant farm workers and slowly draw in other types of manual labor workers to recognize the fact that they needed to unionize, to represent themselves, and to speak back to the moneyed companies and people to fight for representation there. And so we'll come back to that, but we'll just note for now that labor specifically and the labor conditions of the immigrants in particular were a large focus of the oncoming Chicano movement from later. I want to switch to the Octavio Paz piece that you read, and the reason that I've put it here in this section of the class is because Paz writes about the Mexican history as it aligns or sort of deviates from the United States history, and those two histories have crossed and existed next to each other in a way that has created our modern day 20th and 21st century relationship with one another, which if we were to believe simply the Newsday representation, is just very much drawn from immigrants banging at the door of the United States, trying to get here, trying to get to the great American dream and the better life. And that's a little bit overly simplistic in terms of looking at it. Paz himself is actually a Mexican national writer, was born in Mexico City and grew up in Mexico, as opposed to our other writers who are all born in the United States, and Latinos, or not all born in the United States, but eventually came to the United States. He was born in 1914, and he was an intellectual all his life. In fact, he would go on later to win a Nobel Prize literature. There on your lecture notes, you'll see two reasons why I have us read this here. Okay, this distinguishes for us the fact that Mexico and the United States are different places, but really they're different variations of civilization, right? So geographically they're different, of course. Mexico is more tropical, etc., and has more access to all of these things, waterways, etc. But they're also, more specifically, and Paz goes into this, from a cultural, societal standpoint, they're different variations of civilization, okay? Number two, he shows where the current relationship comes from, as I mentioned a minute ago. Why is it that we have this relationship of movement and ongoing immigration patterns, etc.? Okay, so he begins by, and I'm not going to go all through the reading, but if you note, he begins by trying to imagine Mexico as a modern-day superpower and what that would look like and how that would change our conception of the world. Okay, by probing into that, and this is the biggest difference that he sees, is he looks at the colonizers, the people who colonized primarily what is now the United States and what is now Mexico, come from two different cultural European backgrounds. And he looks at the Spanish, who colonized what is Mexico, and primarily the English or the British, who colonized what is the United States these days. And even more specifically than that, the Reformation, the relationship to the church and its effect on culture and politics, was one of the biggest differences that went with these colonizers, these Western European colonizers, as they came into the Western Hemisphere. Different ways of colonizing their new lands, in fact. And the difference that he notes, the Spanish colonizers are inclusive. They come to the natives, they begin to pacify them and adopt them and enfold them into their civilizations, and eventually begin to create generations that are influenced by them and seek out mestizaje, or mixture. The English, on the other hand, are largely exclusive. Okay, and as a former American or English colony, the United States has seen its share of exclusivity in terms of dealing with the natives. Right? We all know stories about the American Indians, Native Americans, being pushed farther and farther west and south and into undesirable areas. And over time, the relationships between the colonizers and the natives are largely combative. Right? Not to say that the Spanish were not combative and the English were totally combative, but largely, on general speaking terms, those are the ways that they emerged, as Paz lays out for us here. And so what happens is over and this takes a long time, understand, over generations, the United States and Mexico come to different paths in terms of their economy and their societal views and their views on culture, and all of those things begin to appear in their political practices and their economic practices. And so dominance becomes a trait of the economy, and enlightenment becomes a trait of one's culture, and power and structure become the way that these particular nations deal with one another. And so United States emerges many, many years later as this dominant, technologically, economically booming nation, and Mexico seems to be wavering in something less than perfection. But in reality, their present day manifestations are built in how they've dealt with their own particular past. It is not as if the people who have founded the United States and Mexico are fundamentally different. They just came about civilization or civilization in several different ways. Now, quickly, we'll look at the other piece that we read. We read a piece of fiction, Rivera's story, And the Earth Did Not Devour Him, is a piece of fiction that has to do with Mexican Americans growing up in the southern part of the Americas. Whereas Octavio Paz's piece was nonfiction and looked at the way that the United States and Mexico grew up differently, Tomas Rivera's piece is a fictional story kind of based on his own growing up in South Texas during the 20th century. He was born in Crystal City, Texas. He was the son of migrant farm workers who were workers that moved around the country following the crops, following the jobs, and never really being accepted into any sort of homeland. And so he worked right alongside them. And gradually he began to seek out his own education, to learn to write, to learn to move beyond the confines of manual labor as a livelihood. He worked in the fields for many years, though, much like Gloria Ansaldúa, alongside his parents. Well, this story that we read comes from his larger novel, which is also called And the Earth Did Not Devour Him, and was published in 1971. And this comes after Cesar Chavez began orchestrating Mexican labor unionization, and they began to realize that they needed to clamor for more and more presence and more recognition of their goals and cultural identities. And so he published this into that time, and he wanted to sort of portray his own experiences, but he didn't do it in a straight-ahead autobiography. He makes it into this fictionalized version of a young boy who watches all of these migrant farm workers around him, and it's the entire novel is kind of a collage, like a little story here, a little story here, all connected, but all looking at the people around him. The one that I had you read is the central story to all of this, and it has the young boy out in the fields questioning all these hardships that have come upon him as he and his family move from here to here. They're always being pushed, and they're sick, and some of them are on the verge of death, and the young boy is feeling this heartache well up in him, and he comes to the point where he's going to challenge God. Where is God in this moment in our life? Why doesn't he care about us? And he's always been told, and he's always felt that if he does this, according to his parents, they will feel the earth coming up to swallow them. God will punish him for this. And at one point, he begins to do this, to strike out and challenge. And he sees the earth coming to open him, but then it does not. Okay, and this is where we get the title of the story and the novel. And he learns that there are moments in his life where he can begin to question and challenge, and it will not break him. He can move beyond his mother and father's generational idea of just going with being labor and just allowing themselves to be treated because they'll be okay eventually, and that they can begin to see the light later. And this young man, he realizes that if I'm going to change that, then I've got to stop. I've got to break what's been happening and have the courage to move beyond that. And so he recognizes that in this symbolic challenging and questioning, where is God here for me? In that symbolic moment, he believes that he will not be devoured, and that he can promote change, right? And he can work to change the way that he's been treated as a laborer. And this, as I said, comes out in 1971, right on the heels of Chavez and others working for labor reform, and it begins to promote a shift in how Mexican Americans, particularly those who are involved in manual labor, see themselves in the United States, and they recognize that they can make change in how they're treated. And so labor begins to be an issue going forward from the 50s and 60s in terms of where Latinos in the United States can look to make inroads, right? We have to recognize that, yes, a great majority of us are manual labor, and those who are want to be treated fairly and heard from and respected. But beyond that, Latinos in the United States in manual labor are only a portion of Latinos, and Mexicans who are in higher skilled and higher paid jobs are becoming more and more realities, and we need to recognize that as well. Okay, that's all for now.